Here we are again. It's a cold winter's morning, not many birds. This week is Naidoc week. And Naidoc week stretches from the 1st to the 2nd Sunday in July. So this week it'll be, this year it'll be from the 4th to the 11th of July. Now, although many Australians celebrate Naidoc week, many don't even know what the words mean, and even many of those that celebrate don't know what the words mean. So Naidoc, it's N-A-N-A-I-D-O-C. So it's National Aboriginal and Islander Day of Observance Committee. Now, it sounds like something that would have been created by a government department. You're quite right. Now, it's extraordinary to believe that the Australian government, the Commonwealth government, had no power whatsoever in terms of passing legislation for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders till the 1967 referendum, when over 90% of the Australian electorate agreed the Commonwealth government should be able to legislate in terms of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. Now this occurred for one very simple reason. When the Australian Constitution was formed in 1901, after a decade of debate and after referendums in each colony, two referendums in fact in New South Wales, because the first referendum to federate was defeated in New South Wales, it's hard to believe in 2022 that the original inhabitants of this land had not been included in the constitutional framework of this country. Now, it's not hard to imagine why, because the first piece of legislation which went through the Australian Parliament was the White Australia policy. We basically wanted a little Europe, or Northern Europe, or Little England in the South Pacific. So although it seems extraordinary in 2022, in 1901, it's not the type of thing that bothered people. As far as Indigenous Australians were concerned, they believed they were smoothing the pillow of a dying race. And considering the genocidal acts which had occurred in this country for decades, it's obvious there was very little interest. So, because there was no mention of Aboriginal Australians and Torres Strait Islanders in the Australian Constitution, it meant the Commonwealth government had no power to override the racist legislation in the various states. Had no power whatsoever. But the 1967 referendum was not just a matter of counting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders in the Australian Constitution. It was actually giving the Commonwealth the power to act on their behalf. And it wasn't until 1972, 5 years after the referendum, that the much maligned Whitlam-led Labor government in 1972 set up the Department of Aboriginal Affairs. Although the Holt government and the McMahon government, two Liberal National Party governments before the Whitlam-led Labor government, had set up offices of Aboriginal Affairs as a result of the referendum, they did not set up a specific department to deal with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander affairs in this country. So once again, the Whitlam-led Labor government is at the forefront, at the very forefront of radical changes in this country. And they set up the Department of Aboriginal Affairs, which was staffed by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders in 1972. In 1975, a decision was made by the department to hold a week of celebrations between the first and the second Sunday in July to bring Aboriginal culture and life to the public's attention. Later on we saw Reconciliation Week, and Reconciliation Week is a different week which usually occurs from the day the referendum was passed in 1967 to Mabo Day in 1992, which we spoke about previously. That is to actually try to repair the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. But once again, Naidoc Week was created to bring Aboriginal cultural and language and rights and struggles to the fore. Interestingly, when the Whitlam-led Labor government was swept from office in 1975 after it had been dismissed by the Governor-General, after a vociferous campaign against its reforms, including its reforms to set up the Department of Aboriginal Affairs, the Fraser-led Liberal National Party capped the budget of the Department of Aboriginal Affairs by 43%. Obviously they were very concerned about the lands rights legislation which had been passed during the Whitlam-led Labor government, which gave Aboriginal people in the Northern Territory and the ACT land rights. Very concerned. So here we have in 2022 the National Aboriginal and Islander Day of Observance Committee, and obviously there'll be events around the country to mark that day or mark that week. And this year's theme is about standing up, but more importantly to remember the trailblazers of the past who made the sacrifices that were needed to bring this issue to the country's attention. Today, we have over 25 million people living in this country, and about 790,000 are descendants of this country's First Nations people, about 3%. Now, most Australians have never met an Indigenous Australian. Many have, but most haven't, especially in the southern states, where the policies which were put in place after the genocidal frontier wars, the policies of segregation and protectionism, basically kept the groups apart. But in 2022 there's no excuses. So the first thing you need to do is you need to look at your local area and see what's been organised with search engines, the World Wide Web. It's not as difficult as it used to be. It's relatively easy to find out what's been organised in your local area, and it's a possibility that you may want to become involved in some of the activities. But what I find extraordinary is there is a long history of Aboriginal resistance, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander resistance to the colonisation process. It's a resistance we're not well aware of, because the Naidoc, the National Aboriginal and Islander Day of Observance Committee, took its example from the 150th anniversary celebrations of colonisation on the 26th of January 1938. That's the 26th of January 1938. And Aborigines in Victoria and New South Wales organised a national day of mourning on the 26th of January 1938 in Sydney as a direct response to the celebrations that were held to mark Australia Day. Now, it's quite extraordinary that over 220 years after the colonisation process began, that we continue to celebrate the beginnings of this nation on the day that the colonisation process began, which is the 26th of January. And we are seeing younger generations now take up the idea that the 26th of January is not an appropriate day in order to celebrate this country. I mean, various other days have been suggested, including Eureka Day on the 3rd of December, Mabo Day on the 3rd of June, Wattle Day on the 1st of September, innocuous day. Australia is synonymous with wattle. Our colours are the green and gold, the colours of the wattle and the green of the leaves. So Wattle Day could be a day, the 1st of September, the first day of spring, could be an important way by which we can overcome the divisions which have now been almost set in concrete between those people who want to continue to celebrate Australia Day on the 26th of January and those increasing numbers who think it's inappropriate, totally inappropriate to celebrate on that day. But what is extraordinary about this country's history is the denial. And although we are now seeing various state governments and Commonwealth governments trying to come to some type of accommodation, and we see discussions about treaty or treaties, we see discussions about truth-telling, there is still a considerable degree of resistance to addressing this issue. And this resistance is due to the fact that the debate is about ownership. It's about private ownership of land. And when the Nazis were defeated in Europe, many survivors of the Jewish Holocaust were able to reclaim land and artworks which had been stolen from them by the Nazis. But we turn the clock forward to 2022 in Australia, and we still find this reluctance to acknowledge what happened, because the aspect of this reluctance is basically based on, as I said before, the question of land ownership. Who owns land? And if you take land forcefully from people without some type of agreement, and that's what a treaty is, then there is unfinished business. It's interesting that of all the British colonies around the world, there are over 60 of them, it's only in Australia that no treaties were entered into with the country's Indigenous people. So when you look at the long history of denial, when you look at the long history of what's been occurring in this country, and you do take the time to look at it, you begin to understand. Now there is a problem. There is a problem currently. And the problem is there are competing groups among Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders regarding who has traditional ownership of particular areas. Now in the north of Australia, these competing divisions are minimal because people have had continuous association with the land. In the southern states, it's a problem. And what we're seeing in Victoria, which I'm familiar with, is that the government is picking and choosing which particular groups which claim traditional ownership it wishes to negotiate with. And this has become a real issue because the Victorian government, to a significant degree, is picking and choosing groups that it knows it will be able to negotiate agreements which are in the interests of the government, where a native title can be extinguished. And currently there are a number of court cases in Victoria which have been taken to the federal court. It's the 1967 referendum, which gives local people who are in conflict with the Victorian state government regarding who and who are not the traditional owners of particular areas, the right to take their dispute to the federal court. This is not just a matter of niceties, it's a matter of survival. Because currently, if the Victorian Department of Aboriginal Affairs decides that a particular group has no association or any traditional ownership rights, what that means is that group, irrespective of how long it existed, is no longer able to access any association with local councils. And as local councils have been the drivers of reconciliation to a significant degree, it means that relationships that have been built up over decades are destroyed overnight because of a Victorian state government decision. And I've been discussing this matter for a number of traditional owner groups that have been frozen out of the reconciliation process in Victoria, frozen out treaty discussions because they haven't been appointed as traditional owners in a particular area, who are now taking their claims to the federal court. It's about creating division within the Aboriginal community in Victoria and New South Wales, but mainly in Victoria, creating significant divisions and picking and choosing who they believe should be the traditional owners, and they're picking and choosing the weaker associations because they'll be able to negotiate treaties which are good for the Victorian state government. So there are multiple issues, but Naidoc Week isn't about looking at the negatives. Naidoc Week is about celebrating. You can celebrate music, you can celebrate the songline, you can celebrate language, you can celebrate culture, you can acknowledge the past, you can form associations. But let's not forget, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities are like the rest of us, ultimately. They can be divided. There are differences. There are religious differences. There are differences in terms of who is and who isn't considered to be a traditional owner. There are divisions, and unless we have a process which removes the state government from directly picking winners and losers in this particular situation, we will find that we will never be able to secure that agreement that is needed in order to go forward with the treaty process. So, Naidoc Week, National Aboriginal and Islander Day of Observance Committee. Started in 1975, continues in 2022. The theme for this year is to remember the pioneers, not the pioneers of colonisation, but the pioneers of the Indigenous movement, which have put the question of truth-telling and treaty at the heart of all future discussions.